Yell out in the chat if you are across this. If you've read it or if you've heard about it, you've probably just heard me ranting about it. Because I think it might be the most important book about music that I've ever read. And I've read like Paul McCartney's biography. Right? Sally? George? Hello?
Hello.
More important than Paul McCartney's authorized biography.
Well, that's high praise. Praise indeed.
Yeah. That's pretty cool.
Okay, so I could introduce you both, but I'd like you to do that. I'd like you to kind of maybe just give us just the tiny bit of background on where you are today, who you are as a person, and then sort of how you fit in music. Before we get to the book, you know, what's your relationship and history with music? Because I know you both wear many hats alongside just writing this book, obviously, doing this research.
Sally, you want to go?
You go, George.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, hi everyone, I'm George Musgrave. I'm a co-author of Can Music Make You Sick with Sally, and my story, I suppose, is that I'm a lecturer based at University of Westminster and also at Goldsmiths here in London, and I do research into what's broadly called creative labour, so it's like working conditions of creative people. Also have an interest in entrepreneurship and competition, and so before getting my lecturing job, I was doing a PhD, and my PhD was in a economics research institute, which was called the Centre for Competition Policy, and that was on competitiveness in marketplaces, and the majority of that was focused in quite a quantitative way on like what marketplaces can deliver for consumers in like the energy market. And I came in and said, I want to do a PhD on what competition feels like, but for rappers in England. So they would have either thought that was like a crazy idea or brilliant, but they seemed to think it was quite brilliant. But it was an interesting institute to be part of. And before that, I was at Cambridge and I did political science. I did my master's is in PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics, which in the UK is like the evil degree now, because like that's what all the MPs do. It's like an evil degree. So it's not. It comes from quite a mixed kind of social sciences background, and alongside this, when I was just before going to uni, I started releasing my own music, which is supported quite heavily on BBC Radio 1 and 1 Extra and stuff in the UK. Was the first unsigned musician to be placed on the list in the UK, which is called MTV Brand New, which is a bit like the BBC Sounds list. Worked with Mike Skinner of The Streets and was supported by like Ed Sheeran, Ellie Goulding, Plan B. I signed a publishing deal with Sony, EMI, ATV, major record deals as well. And it was through doing that music actually and performing Radio 1's Big Weekend, Reading, Leeds. It was through doing that music actually that one of the songs that I produced was with one of Sally's sons, who's a music producer as well. Which was when he said, oh, you need to chat to my mum because she's doing some really interesting stuff and you guys could do some really interesting stuff together.
Do you often get that when you work with musicians? Hey, you have to meet my mum. You should meet
my
mum.
I know. I must say it wasn't usual. It certainly wasn't usual.
George, what's your artist name? We should chuck it in the chat for anyone who wants to just look it up, do some low-key stalking while we chat.
Yeah, for sure. My artist name is Context. So like the song I have with Mike Skinner of The Streets is called Small Town Lad Sentiments. I have quite a cool music video if people want to watch, which is an underwater music video, which is called Drowning. That's quite mad.
Watch it later.
Sorry?
Watch it later.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Context. Excellent.
Yeah.
Nice. Strong name. Okay, so
Thank you.
that's a really interesting kind of combination of things, like music educator, deeply interested obviously in economics and competition and markets, and then also, you know, very active in music with quite hands-on experience with what many people would deem as like successful pathways, I guess, for being an artist or being a musician. So
that's it. And each has kind of continually informed each other, I suppose, as I've kind of progressed through. So just giving different perspectives, basically.
All right, and Sally, in just a handful of words, I mean, so for anyone who's not who maybe would have seen this or not, I had a chat to Sally for Double J, my radio show, a few weeks ago. So this feels a little bit like deja vu because we're covering some of the same ground, I'm sure, no doubt. But we're going to have a lot more of a chance to talk tonight and get deeper in, and also hopefully answer some questions from the chat as well. But Sally, yeah, I know we could talk for 2 hours about your experience in the music industry and the various things you've done. But in a nutshell, how did you get to the point where you hooked up with George to do this research and write this book?
Okay, well, starting from, exactly. I met George through my son. I have 3 sons who work with music or in music. So it's a family. I come from a family of artists and musicians, animators, and I think maybe I told you this before, but my uncle is the animator Yoram Gross, who's Australian, who lived in Sydney, and he did Dot on the Kangaroo.
Oh, of course. No, you didn't mention that, but yeah. Okay, wow.
Yeah, so I come from a family of musicians and artists. Anyway, so that's how I met George. But yeah, basically I started in the music industry trying to be a photographer. Cut a long story short, it was the time when it was the beginning of the rave scene, and so in order to release records, we started to make them ourselves, which meant that my front kitchen became a record company, and I started to sell records out the back of my car. And then I've been doing this for 30 years. I've done everything. I was the first woman to do A&R at Mercury Records, which was the biggest record label at that time. And I walked in, I did walk into a very, very male space and people just didn't know what I was doing there. And I also went in with all my kids, which really, the boss of the label came in, he went, "What is this? A creche?" And I was like, "No, Dave, this is a place without a creche." And it was quite fun, but it was also quite mad. So I've done everything, and then I like in my 40s, I retrained to be a music lawyer. I worked in music law, and then for the last 20 years, I've worked for a French record label that's called Yabasta, and a publishing company called Science and Melody, where I'm the head of business affairs. And we had a band called Gotan Project that have toured Australia a lot. They've toured the world, played Coachella, Sydney Opera House, everywhere. Glastonbury, everywhere. So I've done pretty much most jobs that you can do, and now I run a master's program in music business management. I teach law, intellectual property, and A&R music development, and with George I'm a researcher and a writer.
I think that's what makes this book it's partly what makes this book so compelling, is knowing that between the two of you, you've had so many different experiences in music. So not only do you bring like a lot of academic rigor and research nous and cultural theory and all of that to your findings, you actually both have worked a lot with artists, talked a lot with artists, and even experienced yourself the ups and downs and the quote unquote success or not. It kind of lends real weight to what you have to say in this book, which is, I was saying this to you guys just before we got started, but the book I'm talking about is called "Can Music Make You Sick?", which is a very provocative title, and we'll talk about what it means. But with this book and some of what it talks about in terms of the experience of being an artist, particularly in the context of mental health, I feel like I went back in time 4 years, tapped you guys on the shoulder and said, "Can you please do a research project about the things that I'm thinking about and feeling? That'd be great." And then 4 years later, it just arrived, and I just got to, just yell at everyone about how they have to read the book, because I've never really read anything that is so open and honest about the experience and the unique challenges of being an artist. So we'll get into it, and we'll probably go pretty deep. I hope you guys are ready. I know it's first thing in the morning. You guys got coffee or tea or something, or?
Yeah, had a warm up tea.
Warm-up tea. That's good.
Yeah.
Very good. There you go. I'll say hi to Kat and David, who are in the chat saying hello. Wolf J is here as well. So yeah, feel free to just throw your own thoughts in and your own questions. But actually, before we do get into the weeds, I wanted to start by saying, you know, I've had friends who have started reading the book. In fact, I think Angus One said this in the chat before. I've had a couple of friends start reading the book and then have to kind of pull out of it because it's so heavy, because it's quite confronting, a lot of what's in there. So before we start, I will just say to anyone, like, what we talk about in the next hour or so might actually raise some very uncomfortable and difficult emotions for you. So if you feel like you need to tap out of this conversation, that's totally fine. You can just leave. Obviously, if you stick around, we're going to have as much empathy and warmth and talk through all of this as much as we can. You can share your feelings and your experiences in the chat, because I'm sure the chat room today is full of artists who all feel the same and have had inklings of the same feelings. But I did just want to say up front before we get started, it could get pretty heavy, and to look after yourself first and keep that in mind with what we're going to talk about. But yeah, oh, hang on. Is there music still playing? Oh, okay, let me turn that off. Thank you. Apparently there's music still playing in the background. Sorry, this is my first time using the internet. Thank you, Fairy QHQ, for letting me know about that. Okay, so I was going to come up with a whole bunch of statistics and stuff, some sourced from your book, some sourced from elsewhere, to back up the statement that I think we all intuitively know, which is that there is a mental health crisis in the music industry. Artists in particular, but all people who work in music, suffer greater levels of depression and anxiety than the general public. And that's in an era where mental health is acknowledged as a growing problem among just the general society. So without going into all the stats, we can just, you know, I think we all feel that, but there's also been a lot of research recently to back that up. So I wanted to start by talking about abundance, because that's something that I feel like is at the core of a lot of what you talk about in the book. But it's a concept that not all musicians and not all music fans have fully internalized in 2020. So who wants to have a crack at sort of explaining this concept of abundant music and how that, you know, how that starts to frame how artists think about what they do?
Well, I mean, I think we both can, but abundant music is the state in which we found ourselves post Napster, at the point at which digital files started to be copied at and shared at a rate in which it spun out to the point that we're in this situation now. So within a matter of seconds, we can, in some format, if we have access to the internet, conjure up or access any music we think of, or even don't think of. But we could just go classical music, or rock and roll, or early blues, or folk, or neo-folk from New York in the 1990s, or punk from the 70s, or post-punk from the 80s, or whatever. You can access it. And the state of abundance is not merely the ability to have that music or be surrounded by that music. The concept of abundance for George and I is more than that. It is also the state in which, when you have, in a sense, you might just want to call it musical information overload, if you wanted to just reduce it to a kind of binary, the existence of a zillion binary codes that produce. But by being in that state, one of the things that level of that quantity, that oversupply brings, is it kind of neutralizes, you know, in a sense, it reduces everything to the same 0 and 1. In that part, it reduces everything to sets of codes, and in doing so, it dehistoricizes and deterritorializes music, so that it all becomes the same. You know, it's like, sometimes we call it like, it's like hyper Adorno. It's like, if you were familiar with the Frankfurt School, so everything becomes, all music becomes muzak, because everything begins to lose its meaning in that density of information. And another characteristic of that is that anybody trying to contribute to that abundance has this paradoxical position where, at the same time, you feel like you can contribute, and you obviously you can, but the possibility of being heard becomes ever more difficult, even at the time it's held out to you. So for me, abundance is a bigger concept than merely a lot of music. It's that whole thing. But George has got some other ways of explaining it.
And it's it's right. That's right. And it's like it is more than the just being a lot of music. And I think one of the things that was interesting, I suppose, there's two dimensions to the answer, right? One is that a kind of critical reading of the implication of the term abundance. So abundance, when you think about the word, even like the word abundance, outside of the sphere of economics, for example, abundance is often considered to be a good thing, right? Like an abundance of fruit or like an abundance of vegetation or something like that. There's often a kind of normative implication to the word abundance that implies that something is good if there's an abundance of something. There's not necessarily a negative implication of the word abundance. And tied in with that then is this idea that we refer to a lot in the book, which is that this kind of what we refer to as like a techno-positivist logic of the music industries, which sees these new technological developments as being good. This whole like, oh, there'll be an app for that, like, oh, it's great, like it's going to solve all of our problems, and in this smile economy that we all live and work within, this is all to be heralded as a good thing, because like there's more music being produced and that's wonderful, and look at all this new music that as consumers we can listen to. But what we wanted to do is to also say that abundance is also a qualitative experience, an abundant marketplace within which there's this profound overproduction, is also something that people experience in a qualitative sense. And the term that has driven so much of what I've thought about since I read it, this term's from 2006. I read it in 2010 when I was doing my PhD, and it's called the Babel Objection. And the Babel Objection says, when everyone speaks at once, how can anyone be heard? And I just think it's such a simple, beautiful way of capturing so much of what it is that we talk about under this prism of abundance, because it's something that needed interrogating, and is being interrogated by people. It's not just us doing that. But the idea that in economic terms, abundance can lead to like what's called suboptimal market outcomes, which is like prices falling, profitability falling, all that stuff. And what we wanted to say was, okay, cool, that's interesting to look at the consumers, but let's look at the producers and find out what are the suboptimal outcomes for them. Because if the uses of music, what Sally was just talking about, everything's becoming neo-music, it's playlist to study to, or playlist to do yoga to, or playlist to fall asleep to. If the uses of music for consumers is changing in this abundant environment, the uses of music must be changing for producers too, and the way they experience producing the music. So it's a big like conceptual umbrella, and for a lot of what we do, this idea of abundance.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, the language of music is very interesting. You know, like going back to the "Can Music Make You Sick" as a provocative title, and I was doing a health show. I've been interviewed on 2 women's health shows that deal with health and well-being, and the title, the people are like, "Can music," that's a very provocative title. And actually I always say to people, well, it's actually just a question, and actually we've asked this question, it's been asked of music hundreds of times, and the idea that there can be music that's morally corrupt and corrupting is a very, we have that right now in England, where a type of music known as drill music has been made illegal, right? And which is young kids talking about violence and gang activity. That's how it's conceptualized, and the police have managed, they're saying that. And we can also see it's like massively racially profiled and all these other things, but it's completely and every day that rock and roll is the devil's music. It started as the devil's music, and in this moment of Black Lives Mattering and talking about popular history, the idea, all of these ideas have so many social overtones and histories that actually just asking, can music make you sick? I simply haven't got to the bottom of that. So I always say to people, well, actually, I'm still interested in the idea that music could potentially make you sick. And I'm not, sound can definitely kill you. Sound can kill you. Bass noises can destroy your life, right? So if people tell me that music can't make me sick, I just think you haven't thought about that long enough. Right. And so I'm really interested in the fact that, like with abundance, as George says, abundance is this like super positive term. Right. But it's not merely, it's abundance. It's very, you've got to think about these things a lot more in the way that certain ideas, we call it, like you call it the stickiness idea, there is a certain way in which this idea that technology is always progressive. It's always going to deliver us an answer. So all technology is good. It also sticks to music. The music industry fetishizes technology in a way that it actually got caught out. I think if you look at the history of what's happened in the last 30 years, I'm not saying that the internet isn't good, and I'm not saying that digital, I'm not actually saying that, but I'm actually saying that if you interrogate the relationship between power players in the music industry and their technological fetishism, you can see how these things happened. You can see how they misunderstood, or in their interest in the idea of having a new format, i.e. the CD, they ran gleefully into the digital future without thinking what that might do for them, and then I can remember I was working in the 90s in record companies, and when people used to make an 8 or 9 track album, suddenly with a CD, people were saying, oh, you need 15 songs. And I was like, well, hang on a minute. Because I used to be a manager, so I realized what that did. That doubled the amount of songs you needed to write for an album. I was like, hang on a minute. No, the contract says 35 minutes. And they were like, no, you need 90. You need 17 B-sides, but there won't be any B-sides. It's a CD. Never mind, you just need extra bonus tracks. And so the actual format in itself really produced this idea, without people necessarily noticing or thinking about it, that musicians had to make more songs, write more songs, as if musicians are there's a wonderful Maya Angelou quote, which I use all the time, which is that ideas are limitless. You can just give them away, I'll have another one. But actually, when you're a producer of ideas, or a producer of songs, or a producer of music, it doesn't seem limitless when you're in that process, when you're, so it's like, well, I could say, as a woman, I could probably have had 30, 40 children in my life. Would that have been useful? Right? That's what I always say to people, just think about it that way. Would it, I could have produced that many kids. Is that a good idea? Really?
Well, I guess even you see Daniel Ek saying it in recent statements, encouraging, the one of the kind of founding principles of Spotify is to get, not to say, not to force you to have more children, but is to say like, hey, artists, you should be putting something out every month. You should be putting albums out every 3 months. Yeah. That whole idea of, that's another kind of abundance. I guess just on abundance, before we move on from that, like I wanted to throw in my own experience, which is as a radio broadcaster being serviced music, the scale, the amount of music that I get sent and that I attempt to listen to every week has quantitatively and qualitatively, in a weird way, increased from my experience. I want to try and explain that a little bit, because I think this is to do with the idea of the democratization of tools for musicians to create, and also, an element of the new kind of digital creator culture where everybody's a creator. And there are wonderful benefits to these things. There are movements of music. There's also political, cultural movements that would not exist if it weren't for the democratization of these tools. They don't necessarily, it's a good thing that you no longer have to go and hire a expensive studio and an expensive engineer in order for your ideas and your experience to get expressed. Like there are good things to that, but the flip side is it's never been easier to make music. It's never been easier to make music of a very high quality. you can get on to BeatStars or some sort of beat making platform, get a legit, fully fleshed out arrangement that sounds pretty close to something that's on the radio, and then work something over the top with a handful of YouTube clips and tutorials on the internet to kind of get you to a place. None of this is necessarily bad, but I think it's worth thinking about. And the thing that to bring it back to the experience of an artist and how we as artists process this reality, I think there's something to be said for, on the one hand, there's never been as much music as there is now. I like to say this, like, I'm an artist, like Tim Shield makes music, but I know that there are thousands of Tim Shields in the world, right? Like there are thousands now, more. But I know that because I think about this stuff. But with social media being the way it is, and the way we connect and the way we imagine ourselves, and we all operate in these bubbles, which we all know more about now, these political and other cultural, social bubbles on the internet, I think it's actually pretty easy to forget that music is that abundant. And then that leads to something which I think is also at the core of your book, which is the tension between expectations and reality. The tension between what an artist eventually ends up expecting or thinking they're going to get out of the act of sharing their music, versus a reality where there's not. It's that the Babel concept that you mentioned, you know, there's simply so many people speaking that it's pretty hard to cut through. And it doesn't matter how great your music is or how cool your ideas are. And that's a really confronting thing. So this idea of, you know, delusions versus reality, like that, so part of writing this book is 4 years of you guys speaking with artists, you know, doing quantitative research, but also a lot of just conversations and interviews. How did you approach that when you're talking to people and you're realizing that a lot of that anguish, that sadness that comes from artists is due to them not having the right frame of reference for what they can achieve? Like, how do you navigate that conversation when you're talking to someone?
Well, I think like methodologically, it was actually quite an interesting exercise in terms of how we constructed interviewing people, because ultimately what we decided to do was to actually have a series of fairly broad questions, just asking them about their experience of being a musician. That was broadly what we were asking them, and the way we kind of constructed it, the kind of grounded theory approach to the way in which we constructed it, was just asking these fairly broad questions. Tell me what it's like being a musician. Tell me what you love. Tell me what you don't like. These kinds of questions. And then what we ended up was like this stack of transcripts of like hundreds of hours of interviews of us speaking to people. And what we do this process where it's called like coding, right? You like code them for themes. You look through and see what themes emerge. And so what you do is you like let loads of themes emerge. Theme 1 is family. Theme 2 is money. Theme 3 is future. And there were loads of them in a table. And then you're clustering them into these big kind of thematic areas. And it was just one of these thematic areas that came through was this one that you've mentioned about, we call it expectations and the myth of the future, which is linked. There's a lot of things within this discussion, notions of what success is, notion of what failure is, notion of how blame for failure is attributed by musicians to themselves or to others. But a lot of it, I feel, one of the reasons I think, well, I think that we've been able to be successful in trying to articulate some, or people tell us we've been quite successful in being able to articulate these ideas in this book, is because I think me and Sally are quite well attuned to, I guess, like different conversations that are taking place within disciplines. So whilst there are these like academic discussions that go on about what is abundance, what is ubiquity, what is social justice, these kinds of discussions, there's also like what I would call like music industry discussions, like music industry rhetoric. And this is the music industry rhetoric that you see exemplified at things like panels, you know, like panels that you get invited to sit on and chat at. And
love a good panel.
Yeah.
I think we're on one. I think we do. Hang on, wait. Are we doing one? Oh no.
Are we part of that problem?
Oh no.
But But one of the things you find that at like these music industry panels, for example, these ideas of like, I've sat on them and there'd be like kids in the room that I know were like me like 10 years ago, you know, and they're like, guys, it's amazing. Like all the tools are in your hand, you know, monetize your YouTube video, get yourself some songs uploaded and just start building, you know, and it's never been better, you know, just go for it, do it. And like upload your music and like, you know, this time next year, you'll be on the main stage at Glastonbury. It's all going to change for you. And it's almost like a lot of these things that we're writing about come from like this persistent calling of bullshit. You know, it's like stop bullshitting this because you're massively skirting over so many things. Some of the things that we've been talking about already. But one of them is this idea of this achievement expectation gap that we talk about, right? This idea that like, hey, you know, music is this vehicle for social mobility in a way that like fine art isn't. And, you know, just sign up and take part in this digital economy of hope. And it will transform you like Clark Kent in the phone box into Superman from, you know, a nobody from Cheshire called Harry into One Direction, you know, like boom. And that's what's going to happen. And, you know, A, the data doesn't bear that out, but B, the experiences of the people that we spoke to in the book tell us how they feel about that process and the anxiety they have about the role that this incredibly financially precarious, unstable value chain operation might come to play in the future of their lives. It has big ramifications for people's emotional experiences of that world.
Yeah, I think the language of those things is, again, you know, I think that one of the things about talking to musicians about when you say what it, you know, like for us, we weren't talking to people from another land. We were talking to people in our land, you know. So I think there was the kind of thing that I think is quite interesting about. We wanted to hit, you know, the whole idea of this research was to give an opportunity to the people that make music to talk about what it's like to make music. So that was really at the forefront of what we wanted to do. So we were giving people that felt that they were fighting for some space. So I think in offering people that opportunity, they really took it, that, you know, that everyone we interviewed was incredibly honest. And, you know, like some of the interviews were really, really long. We just let people speak about their lives, because a lot of the time, because of the fact that you have to be presenting your best self and you have to be smiling and you have to be positive. And, you know, I think that because people had to do that, when we said, well, we didn't say you don't have to be that. We just said, talk about your life, you know. So we were giving people that opportunity, because I think that this idea that we experience it, we talk about it in the beginning of the book. It very much, when I first started to pursue the idea of getting money to do this research, I was met with a lot of people telling me it wasn't research, it wasn't something to do. I had a lot, because people were like, you know, all musicians are lucky, they're fortunate. This, you know, and that kind of putting people in a fortunate position, or making it seem like, well, you know, it's not a proper job. People already start with that position. And the position I was starting with, as somebody that had worked in music, you know, for 25 years at that point, was actually, this has felt like a proper job my whole life. And I would like somebody to appreciate that actually people here are doing real work and they're doing it for others. And that's one of the things that I think is really important, wanting, you know, if we actually talk about the fact there is another way to experience making music, there is another way to experience music, and you don't have to simply experience music completely bombarded by this economic framework. You have, you know, that's why I think that one of the things that I'm hoping that the book can do, and I think it, you know, hopefully is doing, is opening up this discussion. You know, when people say to me, oh, it's depressing, or, you know, and you know, absolutely, people have said to me, oh, you know, it's really hard, it's hard going. And I'm like, well, yeah, you know what, it is hard going. It is hard going to be in moments of big change. It's hard going to, digital labor and the digital working environment is very, very different from the analog space. And we ran like happy children, like, whoa, the internet, wow, let's go, woo. And then you're just like, boom, you kind of landed with a big bump and you were like, shit, that wasn't, there's some stuff going on here that you hadn't, trolling and stalking and unpleasantness that goes on the internet, right? And that when you're a creator, in the sense that the musicians we were talking to, they all started, not a single person that we interviewed had not got music as their central focus. They were all dedicated to their music. So they're giving more, if you work in a bank, you may like money, but I doubt you're dedicated to it, right? I don't think there's a practice in that way. And that we know that, we know that there are theological roots to music making. It's very, when people talk about the spirituality, of course, it's part of our emotional world and our spiritual world and all of those things. And if you're working in that space, you're doing more. That, I would argue, these people are doing more than merely turning up for work. They are bringing their entire selves into that place. That's a place of huge vulnerability. And they are doing work for us. I describe music as the most utilitarian of the arts. It does work for us. And even in this new digital space where we understand it as music, I'm going to have my yoga playlist and, like classical music, you can really upset classical musicians by talking to them about classical music as chill out music, or they really don't like it. It's like, no, it's
but
really
it is
serious,
great to chill
right?
out too.
Yeah, absolutely. But that people that have the sets of associations, like this is serious music, this music depart. And I'm like, actually, it's great for just driving. I used to love to drive to techno, but now I'm quite happy to drive just to Mozart. Don't care. And it's like an affront to that music. Do you know what I mean? So within all of these things are very complex things going on. But when you center all of that in the person, it's like, I'm sure George has experienced that as an artist. I've experienced that as a manager. I've seen it in my artists, with the artists that I work with, that no matter how people front it, there is still, you need a lot of front. However you present yourself, this is still something that goes, it doesn't stop at your skin. It doesn't, you're not there's a really great interview at the moment, and talking about music books, is that Gary Newman has written a book. I don't know if you know Gary Newman, the
Of course.
Cars. Yeah. So I didn't know this, but I heard this amazing interview with him, and I have to share it because I think people really, is that basically he's got Asperger's syndrome and he can't relate or read emotion. And he was saying in this interview that he feels it's been the one thing that's allowed him to continue to make music without ever being upset about what people say, because he actually doesn't experience the upset.
Okay. Yeah.
Wow.
And he talked about it, and I was like, so he's talking about his emotional inability to feel emotion or to have empathy with other people as being useful for his own ability to create music. And I thought that was super interesting, because and I'm not going to remember exactly who the author was, but a well-known author who is the son of a well-known author said, people always say, you must have been so lucky, both your parents are authors, that it's so interesting to have authors as parents. And his response was, they don't make great parents though. And then he talks about the kind of how selfish he felt that his father was, because his father was just off writing. And I thought, well, that's very, very interesting, because in our interviews, many of the people that we spoke to, but practically all of them that had families or relationships, talked about their moments of inability to commit to that relationship, or how that felt, or it was full of guilt. Or, I mean, George, you did some of those interviews, didn't you? You this kind of idea that people felt like they had another relationship. Their primary relationship was actually with music.
Yeah, you had these people that were talking like there's a third person in my marriage, and they really talked about it as a relationship that they were having. I mean, one of the chapters we talk about this idea of relationships and like the negative impact that this work can have on the sort of human relationships around you. But as we got to the end of the chapter, I think one of the things we were writing is like, oh, actually one of the primary relationships is like the relationship they have with music making itself and how they feel and understand that relationship. And yeah, sorry, I can't really remember what the question was. I can't remember really how we got here, but yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's the thing, is that within that, when people say, oh, it's difficult to read some of this stuff in the book. It feels negative. It's like, for me, I'm trying to work through that conversation with people. Is like, we can't get better by avoiding the elephant in the room. We can't improve. We can't address, when you're asking people to do, I think musicians do emotional labor on our behalf, I think we gain from it. We gain from other people's expressing stuff that we cannot express. I mean, music serves lots of needs. And if we don't recognize that's what, we definitely recognize that runners that are running, like people that are running fast in a race, just to be the fastest runner, which, I find I love athletics, but sometimes I think, why are you doing that? Like, what happened to you that you woke up in the morning that I want to run 100 meters faster than anyone else? I'm like, where does that desire come from? It's a great, but at the same time, when they do it, that we're enthralled by it, because there's something in our experience that we're like, whoa, look, that's amazing, that's magic. There's something magical and mesmerizing that humans crave. But the people that do that, we have to recognize the sacrifices that they're making. We have to acknowledge that, and ignoring the work that musicians do by going, oh yeah, look at them, they're just musicians, which we address, we've got a whole chapter on that, is like, it does a disservice to all of us. It does a disservice to all human emotion. And that's what I think. I think musicians are emotional, they do emotional work for all of us. And if we dismiss them, we dismiss our own emotional needs. And that's not a good place, right? That's not a good place for any of us, right? So yeah, it's nothing ever changed by things not being difficult, like the women weren't given the vote. No one, bunch of men didn't wake up one morning going, hey, let's give women the vote. No, that did not happen, right? It did. It's like,
and in 2020, we're seeing this across all sorts of things across society and across, what you might broadly call civilization. Like, we are in a bit of an existential moment that's much bigger than just music and artists and musicians. It's across all of these, the climate crisis and Black Lives Matter and Me Too. And, there's this complete, like, seismic feeling shifts happening. And everyone is kind of processing that constantly. I want to come back to this idea, because I've been thinking a little bit about it too, but you guys will have better thoughts on it than me. This idea of the role of the artist and what role the artist plays in society, outside of economic value, outside of like a generator of cultural product that earns money, and whether, like, whose role it is to actually sustain that position, to actually kind of go, we need to make sure these arts are funded in order for society to be healthy. I want to come back to that because I reckon that's huge. But I wanted to pick up on something that you guys were kind of getting to there. And actually, before I do, just going to say hello. So we've had a bunch of people jump on and say hi in the chat. So it's really great to have you all here. There is a bit of a conversation going on in the chat room, which I'm keeping my eye on. So thanks for all that. Becky aka AFA, says, I remember when I was at uni, one of the lecturers one time said, lol, give up on ever having a serious long-term partner if you want to be an audio engineer. I think she was speaking to the idea of difficulty in relationships when you're so devoted to music. But yeah, keep the conversation going in the chat room and just respond to things we're saying and talk to each other, because there's some very good people we got in the chat room today, which is great. But so I wanted to actually call back to last month's chat. So the conversation we had here last month, which, to bring you all up to speed if you didn't catch it, was a conversation around environmental impact and music. So I was speaking to Heidi Lenfer, who's a member of Australian band Cloud Control, who had done a lot of touring back and forth to Europe at the height of their kind of success a handful of years ago. A really well-loved Australian band. And she started to become really unsure about all of the flying and what kind of impact that was having and whether that was a great idea, in line with just a general renewed enthusiasm for climate activism. So she came home, and between albums, like between cycles, she got into climate science research, and she ended up just calling climate scientists from the phone book to talk to them about what can I do? What should I do? What's important? And ended up starting a solar investment fund, which musicians can contribute to in order to, build solar energy, build renewable energy for the future, offset their touring carbon impact with renewable energy in the grid, and also potentially invest in funds for the future for themselves. But the other person I spoke to was a guy called Kyle Devine, who is I want to say professor, because I always get confused. You know how in the military there's like lieutenants and colonels, and I always forget which one's which? It's the same with academics. It's like some are doctors and some are professors, and I always get confused. But anyway, he works at the University of Oslo, and his whole thing is researching the environmental impact of music consumption. So when you buy a CD, when you press a vinyl, when you listen to music on Spotify, what is it costing the planet, and what can or should we actually be doing about that? He's written a really great book called Decomposed. And one of the things that we got to, so I'm eventually getting back to this, I'm also giving you guys a break, is one thing that came up when we were chatting was people would often say to him, man, I love music. Like, why are you doing this? Because a lot of his book is uncovering vinyl's entanglement in petrochemical geopolitics, and how the PVC plants that generate what you need in order to create vinyl are wildly environmentally damaging in emerging developing countries. Or the idea that shellac in the early 20th century was essentially harvested by sort of slave/unpaid labor, and that was where the music industry was born in many ways. And even now in the cloud, we think of environmental impact as being sort of ephemeral or nominal, but it's actually as impactful as ever. And so his friends are like, why are you doing this? Why are you ruining it? Even this morning when I had a haircut this morning from Little Buddha in Collingwood. And my hairdresser, who's a lovely guy, his name's Mike. He loves music. Whenever I go in there, he's always got a different record on. And so he's like brought over this rare African vinyl, beautiful thing. And he's like, check this out. And I was like, oh, I had this conversation with a mate. I've just read this book. And I told him about how quote unquote bad vinyl was. And he was like, why did you tell me this? Like, I love vinyl so much. Like, I care about it. It's the highlight of my week is to go and buy vinyl, and you're kind of ruining it. So it speaks to the role that music plays in all of our lives, that we don't want to interrogate it. Do you know what I mean? We don't want to unpack why does it maybe make a lot of artists very unhappy to work in music. We'd rather not talk about that, especially as listeners, but even as artists, we don't really want to confront that. We want to, because we tie our own identity, our self-expression, our emotional worth into these things that we create. That wasn't really going anywhere, and I don't really have an answer. But thank you.
It's interesting that you say like, oh, and as artists, we think that as well, because we did an interview recently with a journalist friend of Sally's in LA, called Lily. And when she was introducing one of her questions, she was like, yeah. So I'm just going to ask you some questions about this book. Obviously, I've been speaking to a lot of people here about it, and of course, I've had a lot of pushback from some musicians. Or I can't remember if that was the phrase you used, Sally, but something like that. I've had a lot of pushback, and I remember saying like, "Oh, that's interesting. Like, what was the pushback that you had? Like, why did the musicians dislike it or something?" You mentioned the other day in the chat, Sarah, didn't you, that someone had emailed you quite cross about the book or something, like, "Oh no, I don't like the way that that's been approached." I'm interested to hear some of those arguments that people push back about them, but it is that there are just basically like quite uncomfortable ideas within it. Basically, this idea that the work that you're doing that brings you so much joy might not necessarily be, the best thing for you, is a difficult thing to think about. There's a line that we say in the book that says like, "Oh, well, it might be a bit taboo, to say this, but like, do we really need any more music? Do we need more? Like, think how much is out there at the moment that we haven't had the opportunity to like dig into. Think of the kind of cultural insight that we're able to gain from all of these genres and stuff that are out there that no one's even, that's got like 3 streams on Spotify." So that idea, well, do we need more music, is an uncomfortable one. The idea that the music that you're doing can be harmful to you is an uncomfortable one.
And I get that, I mean, there were lots of things that you said just now, Tim, that at the time I was like, yes, and that and that and that. So no, I'm going to try and unravel it and go back to it. But I think I'm a really big fan of Carl's work anyway, and I've read a lot of his stuff, and I've read some not yet to be published, but the next book I think that is coming out with the intro, which is astonishing. And so I utterly love that. I don't have a problem with really understanding the histories of those things or the impacts of them, but because I think that actually the trouble that the problem for us is that with hindsight, people say, well, hindsight's very useful, but actually loads of things are unplanned in that way. People don't see the consequences of it. I'm going to go down this avenue and this is interesting. A lot of things happen by chance, and then they get picked up, and they get so you can't just go, oh, this was a perfect pattern. There was a plan to this. There was a map of how these things unfolded. There wasn't. But beneath them are very interesting histories that have politics, that have real world material experience. And our work, we wanted to connect with real world material, really felt experience. So the thing about saying like what musicians don't want to talk about, that the kind of the denial of, we're also really encouraged to deny it. I would say that neoliberalism deliberately discourages us. It encourages us to deny reality. And actually that's what climate change is a really good example where I think it's really, I kind of think it like it mythologically it's interesting that this small girl from the north, Greta, it's just like a science fiction movie, isn't it? The small girl from the north comes and she says, look, what you're doing is bad, and everyone goes, oh, small girl from the north, magical beast, and then it's like, and then people attack her, the right wing attack her and just say, stupid child. And you're like, God, have you never read a fairy story before? It's just so, it's so biblical. It's such fairy stories. But at the same time, it's like, well, I can enjoy the story, but I actually really want to know what's going on here.
Yeah.
And so that, like, that doesn't, I used to have 44,000 albums in my house. I know that because we had a crack in the house and the insurance company sent people around to count them because they didn't believe how many records we had in the house. So I absolutely know the consequences of collecting. And again, it's a fetish, isn't it? It's a collection. Like, I think this thing that, the taboos of actually saying, do we need more music? It was totally ridiculous, because of course we need more music. I'm like, I don't know. There's so much music out there that I haven't explored that I've always wanted to explore. that I could, that I feel so, I know a lot about music, and yet I feel very ignorant. I feel like there's so much more I could know. And, I might, I might be listening to Alice Coltrane and think, actually, I really want to know more about the jazz women that, that we don't hear about, or I want, I want to look at new wave in another way, or I want to find out about what's going on in the new music scene in Lagos. Or there's so much, right? There's so much. There's no way that what George is saying, what we were saying is there's no way that you can, all of this happens in time. That's the thing. That's the thing that's really important. We live at a certain moment in time. This is the moment in time that we live in. Any amount of really studying or listening to something takes time. And so when you listen to music in headphones and you walk around with your music and you have it on, I'm one of the people living in my house in lockdown at the moment is 25 years old, and they have headphones on all the time. And I talk to them and realize, I think, oh, they're being really moody. And then I realized, no, they just can't hear me because they've got headphones on. And at the end of the day, I was just said to them, yes, I said, oh, how many songs have you listened to today? Because they've got like their Spotify on an endless loop, and they must have heard hundreds of songs because they've had those headphones in all day. And it's like, so there's that kind of like, are you listening, or is that music just shutting out the rest of what's going on in the world? So there's something about digital practices. Like I don't wear headphones, I've got them, but I think they are shutting things out, and that's a digital practice. Like the minute we had the Walkman, the minute you could go out jogging and you could take music with you, music had another possibility, or another practical implication. And that practical implication became about privatizing your space and your music and your musical experience into this one singular person. And that communal activity of music, so what we call the ritual value of music, was shifted. And so the ritual value will take place with a live audience or at a festival. But when you're using music as, I'm very interested in people that listen to music all day long, that wear headphones all the time, because I'm really wondering, I'd really like to look at what's happening, actually happening in terms of the neuroscience of that. What is that experience? Because I don't know that experience, because I have never been able to do that. Although I listen to music a lot in my car, and like in terms of, the bad things we do, I love road trips. I love just driving into somewhere with music and listening to music. And that, I always think that for me, that was because possibly I had kids really young. So I had like 4 kids at home. So if I wanted to have my own space, the car and a road trip was my own space. It was like a room of my own where I could listen to music. So I think those things, they're interwoven, and they are complicated. But I think this root of denial, there's not being able to face, what does it actually mean? What does this actually mean? And who gets to make music? I think everyone can make music. As I said to you before, I think the actual making and practice of music is really, there's so much evidence to prove that it's very, very good for us to actually, it's good brain exercise, it's good coordination, all of these things. But who gets paid to make music? And how does music get funded? It can't get funded by the unit value, because it no longer is a thing of it one single unit value. It's not the one stream, and it's not the one selling thing, and it's not the t-shirt. We've got to think of different ways of how people will be remunerated in a time when a lot of people will be doing creative things, if we think doing creative things is good for society, because that really becomes a political question, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that kind of gets me to where I wanted to go. I mean, that idea, a basic idea of music being so abundant and so plentiful and so easy to access that it essentially has close to no value. I mean, if there's what is it? Justice for Spotify, or Justice at Spotify, that campaign that launched a few weeks ago, really well intentioned, a lot of really noble like things that they're asking for. One of them is, you know, they're asking for streams to be valued at 1 cent per stream. I just think music has become so abundant, you can't go backwards on that arrangement. You can't go backwards on the value of it. That's a whole other conversation. But what I wanted to get to was triggered a little bit by something that someone has said in the chat in response to this idea of, do we really need more music? And the Real Moon Jelly, not sure what the Real Moon Jelly's real name is, said, okay, I'll cancel my release when we started talking about that, right? So quite flippantly, obviously. So don't cancel your release, the Real Moon Jelly. We're not saying don't put music out, but I think the idea that, all right, here's where I want to go to. I get to interview lots of really interesting people, including yourselves. So I got to interview this music teacher who became so interested in neuroscience that she kind of went down that path into the neuroscience of music. And her name's Dr. Anita Collins, and she's become something of a public figure in Australia for championing the positive aspects of music, especially in quite younger education, like primary school through to high school education. So she did a TV show here with a big pop star in Australia called Guy Sebastian, where they went into like an underprivileged area in suburban Perth, took over a school and just gave it the classiest, best music program you've ever seen, access to incredible resources, instruments, teachers, to try and prove the point that, you know, just by putting music into the school, they could increase not just the literacy and the numeracy, but the emotional well-being of these kids who are maybe doing it a little bit tougher. And they, you know, spoiler alert, that panned out to be the case. And she's since done a lot more research on that and written books on it and everything. And it's stuff that you're both music educators, you would be across that as well. It's kind of like documenting and quantifying something that we all intuitively understand, which is music is good for us. Despite the fact that your book is called Can Music Make You Sick, I think we all agree that music is good for us because it does provide us with emotional release. It does express different perspectives and different diverse stories and histories. And we need all of that as a society. But what I feel like happens, and I'm curious whether you guys can speak to this either from your own experience or through people you interviewed. I feel like most artists get into music because they love the feeling of it. It's a sense of play, right? It's a sense of exploring your own skill set, your own emotions, expressing something, and just that pure personal fulfillment. It's not quite ego, but there's a little bit of ego in it, where you just kind of, you have pride for a thing you made, right? Plus the flow state of creating. Like on some basic level, most artists get into creating music from that place. And then maybe you add on top of that if they're motivated by, you know, other things they want to express, ideas, radical ideas, they want to express them through their music as well. But I feel like for a lot of artists, their journey, at least in the first few years of their quote unquote career, is this kind of almost a corruption of that feeling as they start to navigate the urge that they have to share their music with people, right? Because I think there's one step where you muck around with music and you enjoy the process of doing it on a personal level. The next step is when you have that urge to share it with people. And I don't think it's necessarily always that people go, you know, if I share this, I could make lots of money, right? It's often, I think from a lot of artists, it just feels good. They want to share. It's actually more like a connection, like a human connection thing, or a sense that this is going to be of value to someone. I'm going to put it out there. But where it gets corrupted is in the stories we tell and the stories that we see, the narratives that become embedded, I think, in all of us as artists, which are narratives of fame and financial success and entrepreneurship, where we end up in a situation where we've kind of forgotten a little bit why we were doing it in the first place. And I feel like artists often talk about that.
I sort of agree with that. Yeah. I mean, like for me personally, I think on the one hand, it's like, yeah, you do want to put things out because like, I'm just like, for me personally, I remember like, I want to put things out because like I wanted to share them. And like, I had stories that I wanted to tell about my life and all that sort of stuff. And it was joyful and fun, and that's why I was doing it and stuff. And like I've just got a tune back from mastering now, and I'll send it to you for a for a play on the radio. But ultimately, it's a bit like, actually, if you have what we're talking about in the book, which is musical ambition, actually you kind of do want it to give you some money. You are actually hoping that this will be the thing that sustains you, even if the only money it gives you is money to allow you to continue doing it. Because whilst entering the marketplace, like the barriers to entry have dropped, actually it is still an expensive thing to be doing. You still need to spend money on the mastering. You still need to have a Mac that at least half works for you to be able to record in. You still need to have the video that you film and put up. You still need to pay money to distribute it through Ditto, to have it up on Spotify. It does cost you money, like it doesn't emerge out of thin air. And ultimately people do hope that it will give you some money. I mean, I remember making a tune at one point a couple of years ago, and I remember saying, like, this is the song that's going to be my deposit, my house deposit, right? Like, now it's not the only reason I didn't make that song to have a house deposit, but I remember making it and think, I might be able to buy a house with this now, because I did want it to be the thing that gave me some source of income. And so I think that needs to be acknowledged. At the same time, there's another story, is that talking about the joys and the benefits of stuff that music brings you, whilst at the same time we have this idea that music can make you sick. It's this kind of duality of the term music, right? This idea of like music making and music as a career making. And so I feel like it's a little bit sort of trite when people do this thing of like, oh yeah, it's brilliant, like let's encourage music making, and it's brilliant, and it's self-actualizing and fun and enjoyable and all that sort of stuff. Yes, like on the one hand it is, but my story is that like a few years ago I got invited by a school to come and speak to the kids there, to the young people there, to talk to them about going for it and like trying to have a career in music. At the time I was signed to Sony. I lived in like this, I mean, I was renting this house, I didn't own it, but I was living in this beautiful house in like this lovely part of West London, and it was like, oh sick, like you're working with Emily Sandé, like you're doing the thing now, come and speak to these young people and tell them to just follow their dreams and like go for making music. And I said to them, like, well, I'm probably not going to do that, because like I don't really think that's really responsible of me to say like drop everything, become a musician, that's the way, because I actually don't think that's a particularly great look for them to do that, because there's lots of negatives about doing that too, and that it's important to have some kind of balance to what it is that you're doing. And so I'd be happy to come and talk to them about that, and they were like, oh no, like we don't want to hear that, that's not a story we want you to tell. I think it's just it's a mixed picture, isn't it? Like, yes, people do want to make music for these reasons of enjoyment, but at some point there are shifts in people where this musical ambition is part of what they're doing, and they do want it to be their career, and they do want it to be their work, and so it does need to earn them money. And I think when you're in that environment, your experience of the work that you're doing is very different. I remember a year into my publishing deal, my manager rang me and was like, you haven't actually really made that much music this year. You haven't actually written that. How many songs have you written this year, for example? How many sessions did you do? How many songs have you written? And I was like, I don't know, like maybe like 20 or something this year. I don't know, 20, 25 songs. And he was like, you should be doing double, triple that amount of songs. And I was like, how erudite do you think I am? How much interesting shit do you think I have to say? It's like my songs are about like going to Wetherspoons and like being drunk and like, how many songs like that do you want me to make, really? I'm just trying to get the publishing deal and get some money and then like live a normal life where I'm not constantly anxious all day. I don't know where that answer led.
Yeah, I think there are, I would say that there's, what I would say about the going into schools and giving children a rich musical experience that improves their literacy and that's the work that music does. It is socially bonding, and it's replenishing, and it has all of those potentials, right, which we know are good, but they are nothing to do with the expectation that music will earn you a living, or that you would do it. That's music being used to socially enhance a learning environment and bring a community together. Completely different from music as an economic driver. One of the things that our book focuses on is the way that neoliberalism, the combination of neoliberalism and digital technology, have joined together in an ideological form to exploit our desire to communicate through music. And what happens when, you know, what George was just reeling off, all the things that you would spend money on in order to make music, even though, you know, absolutely the barriers to making music, it's not the barriers to making music, I would say it's the barriers to putting music out, communicating it to a wider audience. Because if you look at the early history of rhythm and blues, people had no money and they made music they made fashioned instruments from bits of furniture. They made drums out of pans, right? They didn't need, people made music in concentration camps, right? So if we take it to the most dystopian place, that humans will make music as a way of protecting themselves, as a way of resisting oppression, as, you know, music is really, really useful and good for us in those situations, yeah, as a way of saying that we're here. But those have nothing to do with the economic realities of the exploitation of music as a marketplace, right? And I think that so what's happening in the digital world with music is that we are being encouraged to, without actually knowing that, or actually being conscious of it, we're buying technology. You know, everyone's investing in a better phone, we're upgrading. Look, I got a new microphone, I got new headphones, I got, you know, someone was saying to me the other day, I need to get lights because I'm on the internet, I need a set of lights and I need a this. And so we're just buying all this technology. We're on Amazon, so we were just encouraging. But this has nothing to do with music. Music is just the vehicle with which you're purchasing all this other stuff. And it's exactly what Kyle is saying. It's like, you're uploading to the cloud, you can't see the cloud, you don't know that the cloud isn't just, the cloud has you know, just as clouds are made of water and all of those things, so is the digital cloud made of labor, of real people's work. And those people, some of whom are working, some of them are children. You know, a child contributed to the making of this mobile phone, and I know that every day, right? I know that it was mined in a way, in a place where I wouldn't want my children to be, right? And so that kind of being conscious, like, oh, I can't live with that level of consciousness, I can't live with that level of information, because it's difficult, and it's disrupting. But it isn't also right to deny it. You know, it's not, it's like we've got to be able to talk about this and think about it and understand how it, and to the person that's saying flippantly, I will cancel my release. Well, why? You know, if you wanted to communicate something, but this idea that our systems of communication will be able to provide enough income. This is one of the distortions of this experience, is that the idea that this will generate enough income to pay our rent, when so many people are in it. You know, when I'm giving talks in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, what was once called Eastern Europe, and Latvia or whatever, every single bar I go to, I hear The Clash, Elvis Presley, the Beatles. It's like, I kind of wonder, going, has everybody, are they swapping the same playlist, or is this just one CD that circulates every bar in these places? And then I go to speak to young musicians of that territory, of Latvians, whatever, who say they want to make it in the music industry. And I said, well, the only thing you can do is be The Clash or be the Beatles, because the only music I hear being played here, oh yeah, sometimes I hear the Bee Gees. It's so random. Or the Eagles. I'm like, is this whole place in some kind of 70s distorted time warp of, you know, top rock hits. So if you don't make, you can't be those things. You see what I mean? So I think that we really have to think about this, because I really know that people will carry on making music, whatever we say and whatever we do. And I don't think that's a bad thing. People will always make music. Everybody that can, that wants to, will continue to make it. And nothing that we say, no matter, you know, no, it's like the war on drugs. They're not going to win. Just not going to win, you know. People will carry on doing it because it's pleasurable. You know, it's pleasurable. It's needed. We love it. It's, you know, it's enjoyment, and you need all of that. But we have to think about how we feed ourselves and that, I mean it, that in the biggest holistic way, emotionally feed ourselves.
I think I look, you can make such a strong case to say that now more than ever we need artists, you know, to be telling stories and expressing things and reflecting the issues of the day back at us and amplifying the right messages. And, you know, the role of the artist is important, and it's not necessarily a purely economic role to churn out product. You know, there's a lot more that art can give us. We've talked about a bunch of it already, but like that idea of doing the emotional labor for us, or providing the vessel through which listeners can access their own emotions and figure out their own identity. And like we all sort of know that, but I guess there's two things here that I'm not sure are necessarily, like, they're intertwined, but they're kind of separate conversations. One is, how can the labor of creating music be funded properly or be valued correctly? Or I got into real trouble a few weeks ago on one of these panels, a virtual panel for Big Sound, where the conversation was about management, but it's because I am obsessed with your book and other things at the moment. I changed the subject and started talking about stuff like this. And I think the question was, if you were an artist just starting out, what advice would you give them about the music industry? And I got triggered by that word industry, because I've been talking a lot recently about the difference between the industry and the community, which is, the community is all of us, and the industry is that economic level where there's, you know, people have jobs, and it's mostly the scaffolding with a few artists sprinkled in. And, you know, I got a bit triggered, and I was sort of saying, like, well, you know, I think with the keeping in mind the how hard it is to cut through, I would probably tell most artists to not focus on the industry, and maybe actually not be thinking too much about that, and just be following the other outcomes and finding other value in the creative process, rather than just strictly chasing financial outcomes, because it's so hard to do. And I got into trouble from someone who was a union rep, who hit me up with some DMs and some public tweets sort of saying, like, Tim Shield from Triple J thinks music doesn't have value, thinks that musicians shouldn't get paid. And I luckily we thrashed it out in some emails and stuff, because obviously I don't think that. None of us think that. Like, we all wish that all musicians in the world could get paid. But you know, the reality is actually that's not going to happen, and nor necessarily should it happen, that every single artist in the world should get paid a full-time job to create their art. But two big questions here. One, what do we do? What do we campaign for at perhaps a governmental level to ensure that the arts are funded? And is that something like a universal basic income? Was you hinted at, like, deciding as a society, hey, we should make sure that everyone has this amount of dollars in order to devote this amount of time to being creative and being cultural. The flip side of this is, I think, much more important, which is you put all of the financial reality of where we're at right now to one side, and you just say, your research has uncovered the fact that musicians are so unhappy. And if we have a generation of artists who turn away from music, or are so unwell, dealing with such mental illness problems that they can't function, that's going to cause such great loss to culture at a time when we actually need artists most. So what do we do now? And let's actually focus on this second part, because I think we've mostly got artists in the chat. What can artists do to make themselves, to insulate themselves from some of this mental health stuff that is a result of, you know, financial models and a result of unrealistic expectations and stories that we're told. Like, give us the happy ending, or at least some steps that artists should take to be thinking about or doing to remain resilient and keep being creative and keep being artists.
Well, I would I'll let George say, but my thing would be to create community. I mean, I think that music is essentially a social vehicle, and I think that the most important thing that you can do for yourself as an artist is reach out and make friends with other like-minded artists and make community, because you need the support to do this work. It's a lonely road on your, it's a lonely road, and it demands that. All disciplines demand that, but I think make community. And that you did say something in what when you were talking, Tim, you did say something that begs the question. We have to say who are these artists going to be that get funded, and why will they be funded? These are very, very different questions. The idea that the market in and of itself will find the solutions to all of those things has been thrown really into the middle of the motorway in the pandemic. We can see that the market is not responsible like that. The market doesn't go out saving things. It just isn't happening. So we have to understand that there have to be interventions, and those interventions beg big questions. And for any artist that wants to pursue music, I say get involved with those questions, to build community, get involved with those questions. If you want to save yourself, you have to save others, and if you want to save music, you have to do the work. So I think that I would say that those were important things to do, and within that you will find solidarity with others. You will find communion. You will. It's great. I think that's what's always been wonderful about being part of the music communities, is the wonderful friendships that you have over the years and the things that you get to do. George?
I perhaps, depressingly, don't really know the answer to that question. I think one of the things that we've done in the book is to introduce a lot of questions and to explore a lot of those questions. But one thing it certainly doesn't do, and I don't think in many ways doesn't really try and do, is provide answers. Doesn't say, okay, well, what it does is kind of identify a symptom, and people smarter than me and smarter than us, I'm sure, will come up with interesting solutions for it. In terms of what musicians can do, I think there's ways that you can try and mitigate lots of the forces and stuff that are in the book. I think Sally's right insofar as individual solutions for what is a social and collective problem are not at all helpful. I don't think discussion, like the other day, I almost winced at this, and I WhatsApped it to Sally with this, the kind of teeth emoji, which was a discussion on BBC Radio in the UK, which was resilience for artists, and I thought I almost don't even want to listen to this, because it's just going to be take some time out every day, and make sure you're thinking about this, and it's all just it's just running up a hill like the travelator on Gladiators that comes out and you're just desperately trying to run up it.
Yeah.
I mean, in many ways, I think this is just me thinking out loud. This isn't answers that we put in the book. This is from my perspective of a musician, I suppose. I think just thinking about what you're hoping that your music career is going to give you is a helpful thing to be thinking about, because if what you're hoping that it gives you is the ability to perform, to share, to have enjoyment, to meet other people, to express yourself and write those songs, and it gives you that, and therefore it's giving you that, then in many respects that constitutes success for you, because you're able to achieve what you want to achieve from it. If what you want to achieve from it is other things, and you find that it's struggling to provide you those things, then sometimes there needs to be painful rethinking. I mean, speaking for me personally, I have a very funny relationship with this, insofar as in some ways I'm much happier now I don't make music, you know, and that's an uncomfortable thing. I mean, I did just get a tune back from mastering, and like, yeah, I'll put something out. I probably put out now like a song a year, because I do it because why not? Because I don't have anything to lose. Because ultimately now I don't really care if I get 500 streams. Whereas before, if I put a song up and it got, say, 30,000 views on a YouTube video in a month, I actually might private that video because it doesn't look like I'm doing well enough, because that's not enough views. Because then when I pitch that to Radio 1, I don't look like I'm a big deal now. And when I'm trotting up and down Kensington High Street with the songs that I'm produced, asking people for a record deal, ultimately it's like, really, I need like 30, 40, 50,000 pounds. Realistically, that's what I need from this, because otherwise I could earn this amount of money working in McDonald's. Do you know what I mean? I could just go and work in McDonald's, and I'd probably be richer working in McDonald's than I would be putting this music out. But because I wanted it at the time to give me something that for me it wasn't giving me, I wanted to go on a holiday that wasn't camping. I wanted to be able to go with my wife to a restaurant that wasn't Pizza Hut with a voucher cut out of the free newspaper that they give out at the tube stations in London. Because when you hit 30, that gets grinding, actually. And ultimately, it just became long for me. It became smashing my head into a brick wall and being upset a lot. That's what it became to me. And so I just thought, I'm not doing this now. But at the same time, I miss doing that hugely. I miss like every day my manager messaging me and being like, I've got you in a session with this producer today, like go there and just hang out and like make music and stuff all day. Like I miss that hugely. I miss like turning on the radio and like Mr. Jam's playing a song 1Xtra and I'll record the audio and tweet about it and people like share your videos. And I miss that. I miss editing music videos and putting them up and having that and people saying, oh wow, like look at this music that you're doing and talking about like suburban kids in satellite towns in Norwich and stuff. Like I do miss all of that, but at the same time I don't miss the grinding disappointment it can give you, because for me that's what it gave me, a lot of disappointment, and for other people it wouldn't. And I think it's like, what does it mean to you? What do you want it to give you in your life? And if it gives you the things that you want it to give you, you're winning. That's hashtag winning, right? But equally it might not be. And if financial sustainability is one of the things you want it to give you, let me give you a heads up. The data tells you it probably won't give you that. And that's the problem, I think, with this entrepreneurialization of everything, this idea of musical ambition, of forging your career, that actually this is what it comes down to, right? Turning what Bourdieu called transubstantiating, but that's just French for converting the social and ritual value of what music can give you and others into the economic value of financial sustainability that entrepreneurial practice tells you that you can achieve, is actually incredibly difficult to do and has become increasingly difficult to do. And if you run into it with this idea that it will give you that, many people, the data tells you, many people will be disappointed. That's just the way it is. That's what leads to this discussion that says, well, perhaps we need political solutions to this, because we say in the book, there's never been a time where we've imagined that the market can sustain artists. It doesn't matter if it's the Pope paying Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or if it's punks in England in the 70s on the dole. You know, Sally always says, oh, I started a record company on the dole in my kitchen in Finsbury Park. That's a relationship between the state and music making. It's just indirect. It's like council housing and grime, or youth clubs and grime. That's a relationship between the state and music making. It's just indirect. We're all having this discussion now. And like Sally said, COVID has thrown those discussions into incredibly sharp relief, because they're saying, well, the market isn't going to sustain us. The difficulty is now that you're having like lots of competing voices, and it's, you know, even as people that like love music, I think it's pretty difficult that makes an argument to go, well, we should just pay all artists to like make music, when people are like, well, there's lots of things that the market isn't providing that we should be paying for. The market, like at the moment, this is one that I'm being confronted with. The market is clearly failing to provide like affordable childcare. Like the nursery at the end of my street is going to take all my salary, like basically all of mine and my wife's salary. You know, there's a fairly compelling argument that says, well, can we just pay a parent to like stay at home and look after children. That's something valuable. Maybe that's more valuable than paying people to make music. These are political questions, right? That people are currently trying to work out and trying to square and arguing the merits of, plus or minus,
Yeah,
Sorry,
I
you were
think
going to come in, Sally.
George, that was great.
I think
That was great.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I do think all of those things are true, but and at the same time that, the complexity of this and how paradoxical it can be at moments is that you can see that out of unknown places come new musical experiences and new music things that they, my niece makes artwork on those fake nails. She's a nail technician, but she studied fine art, and she's making, and they're like 18th century miniatures. She's painting whole pictures on the ends of nails, and now her nails are really sought after. So her nails are getting the artists that do grime videos, the girls that are dancing are wearing her nails, and so she's getting a lot of work out of nails in videos. It's like, it's so mental that you could never, I saw her go off to art school and I thought, great, she's going to art school. Next minute she's like painting nails, but the nails are, and then she's in the magazine and being written about because she's painting on nails in a musical video. And so the extraordinary things happen all the time. And when those things happen, because we've invested so much belief in this, we're like, whoa, look at that, wow, off we go, chasing another rainbow. In that sense, we are, that's that's a wonderful human condition. No matter, we might be faced with a lot of facts that might seem extremely bleak, but somehow we will turn them into hope. We'll turn them, and that's good. I want to have hope. I want to have, I want to think that we will work some of these things out, but they are complicated. They do involve politics. There's no way that they don't involve politics, but there's also absolutely no place that we have seen humans without music. We haven't ever found a tribe that didn't make music, or we turned up and here's a tribe. Don't have no music. That's, you can rely on humans to make music. So I don't feel like we'll stop making music. But I do recognize that our relationship with music, certainly in the global north, and I would include Australia in that, in the rich world, music is thoroughly embedded in our form, our essential forms of communication, but also now in different practices. So for me, I see a lot of the connections between music as emotional labor leading to music as medicine. And I will not be surprised when we see music used in those forms. There'll be this, in the way that you can already see neuroscience looking into the brain to see what music does to it. I wouldn't be surprised if we find in 10 years, even less than that, there'll be people, and they're already doing it. What happens to the brain on music in depression? How can music help a depressed mind reset? I wouldn't be surprised at all. So the value of musical activity is more than a pop single that goes to #1 in 5 different countries simultaneously. Right? So it's like, you can't reduce it. And music is a massively complex art form with loads of different implications. And if you make music and every single musician that we spoke to, their primary pleasure that they expressed came from music. So despite the things that were difficult for them, music was always a source of restitution, of relief, of a safe harbor from the world. And that is, I think that's that kind of going to music in a moment. I was saying that to somebody the other day, that there are certain songs that I return to replenish myself, just to feel better, or to feel sad or to feel happy. It's just like certain things. And there's been lots of evidence to show how it's called the memory bump. you know, the music that we had in our formative years between like 14 and 16, 17, that music has particular implications for our ability to make memory chains. And it will be different for everyone, because we'll all, you know, we have to make music because we have to have music for us. You know, each generation has its music and you can explore it, but it still won't have the same emotional attention. And neuroscientists can show that. They can show how the brain becomes excited by music that it knows or it feels attached to. So there are, you know, there is interesting stuff going on about that.
I think we've got about maybe about 15 more minutes, and we're kind of, feels like we're getting to sort of a natural endpoint anyhow, guys. But in the chat, if you want to, if there's any specific questions, maybe do you have for Sally or George, while we have them very generously sharing their time with us, chuck them in the chat, and maybe we can get to just a couple of them before I let you guys go. But I do really, to kind of come back to the idea of, I think, if you're curious about all of this, I think as an artist, reading this book is obviously a really good idea. But I think if there's one kind of takeaway from what we were just talking about at a personal artist level, it's that idea of trying to connect with, I think, what you called the social and ritual practice of music, which is about taking whatever that urge to connect is and channeling that into a connection with literally just the people around you. Smaller communities of artists, smaller communities of what you might call fans, or just people who you have things in common with, and trying to disconnect a little bit from the stories, the narratives of wide success and big audiences. I remember I did a tweet thread, one of my famous tweet threads, a few months ago, where I was talking about having Facebook pages, how wouldn't it be cool if we had like a different thing that wasn't a Facebook page? Like, what a stupid thing. I was ranting about that. And somebody replied saying, but I can't possibly turn my Facebook page off because, you know, there's like 3 billion people on Facebook. Like, of course I've got a Facebook page. And it was just this idea of like, 3 billion people are never, 3 billion people aren't going to listen to your music. You are actually possibly going to be more fulfilled personally and possibly even financially if you concentrate on finding the 30 people, not the 3 million people. You know, that is that 1,000 true fans thing that did the rounds 20 years ago or whatever it is now. But that idea of like, not only will it be infinitely more personally fulfilling, it's actually much more achievable and potentially financially a better situation if you just concentrate on literally the people around you, or the communities that you can connect with that are right in front of you. And I will,
I do sort of agree with that. I do sort of agree with that.
Yeah.
The issue that I run into is, as like, this is like a UK example, is as somebody who is from a part of the UK that is really very removed from the music industry, is that if you say, oh yeah, you know, rely on, you know, build those networks around you. The thing is like, if the network around you, if the person that you go to school with, if their mum is in a pop group, and, you know, the guy who sits 3 rows back from you in primary school's dad is the marketing guy at Atlantic, and then a couple of people in your class, because you all go to school in this part of South London or West London or whatever, one turns out to be this singer, another one turns out to be this rapper. As it turns out, the people around you go on to do, you are plugged in to a network of people that live in West London or North London. They're always in London, basically, but historically it also has been in Manchester. You know, in the you know Manchester used to be a thing. Manchester's not a thing now, but, you know, Manchester used to be a thing. But whatever. Yeah, I know. I'm being trite. But the thing is that when your network is like in a village in Norfolk, and the people around you are, you know, a variety of things, you know, everything from school teachers to working in Cafe Nero to estate agents, whatever.
Yeah.
You're not plugged into a musical network. And then what happens is that the networks that gain power and gain traction are those ones that are already plugged in to big reserves of social capital. And then you see these people, you see them all the time. Like I see them all the time in guests that come onto our course, in people that we speak to, people in music, and they're like, oh yeah, I was just hanging out with this friend of mine, and his dad was, he was the executive at Atlantic, so I gave him a record, and, I happened to be going to school with someone who was in a pop group, and we just met up one day and started chatting. It's like, your network isn't my network.
Yeah.
In my network, people sell car insurance at Norwich Union, at Aviva. That's my network. So the problem with those is the inequalities are very powerful there. And what happens is people still like move to these places. You have to go to these places to cultivate those networks. And so it's one of those things where it's like, yes, I do sort of agree with it, that like build what's around you. But the problem is if what's around you is this kind of a cottage industry, and actually you don't want to be part of a cottage industry, it so depends. But like I could have been like, do you know what I want to do? I just want to make hip hop with like people in Norwich that make hip hop. And there's lots of people that make UK hip hop in Norwich that aren't trying to be on Radio 1, aren't trying to be on One Action, that wouldn't play them, and do little shows there and cut out, and people know them. They go out in Norwich, people, everybody knows them, and it's like a little community of people that are there in the little city that I'm from. But if your goal is to, I don't know, whatever, win a Brit Award, you're probably not going to win one making that hip hop in Norwich. That's just probably not going to happen for you. So the what you want out of that, I think, that's what I mean about it. A lot of it's related to the personal, and I think in these discussions when we tell people as well about like rediscovering the joy in what they're doing and all of that, I do agree with that. Like I really do agree with that. But at the same time, people want to get paid too, and the hustle of trying to do that is hard.
Yeah, I think people do. I think people, obviously people want to get paid, but I think the problem, the illusion that has been sold, the way that music has been mobilized, and I would say this of the creative arts, it's very, very apparent in England particularly, and it's very apparent in London. London is a creative center, Manchester is another creative center, that this kind of creativity is going to create all this work is actually a consequence of the loss of industrialization. There's a history to how this has happened, and the reality of that is that the creative industries fed into an expansion of higher education, and higher education brought in student fees, and there are all these things that have happened that they're really important histories that are not transparent. People are unaware that they're linked in that way, because what they say is keep your eyes on the prize, keep looking in this direction, or live in the moment. It's one of my like, I totally get what people are saying. Don't worry about the future, leave your baggage of the past behind, but also live in the moment is what I think one of the most damaging it's not even a phrase, is it? It's a kind of, what do you call it? It's a demand that you live in the moment, so therefore you cancel history. And we had a brilliant speaker come into the MA, because one of the fortunate things about running a master's degree in music business management in London is because we have access to some really brilliant music people, and we had a brilliant young Black female A&R person come in last week, who's 24, 23, who made an incredible statement in class where people were saying, oh, I like every genre. And she said, well, if you like every genre, you haven't taken the time to learn anything about history. And I was like, whoa, okay. And she really laid out her commitment to the genre that she was interested in. It's history, and it was real, like, in a way, it was really interesting to see, and very inspiring to see a young person that's grown up in this abundance with the ability, who totally understood about hopping between these things, but really understood about the real pleasure you get when you really decide to commit to something and to learn about it. And I thought that that's a really interesting change that's happening. Young people are certainly are 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 very knowing and are producing coming up with interesting ideas and resisting this position. But as George says, when you can't think that the cultural industries and the creative industries, it's like saying, I really love that song, My Personal Jesus. I think that if we all had our own personal Jesus, we wouldn't actually need Jesus. I mean, not that I'm not religious at all, but I'm just saying that if everybody had their own personal Jesus, we wouldn't need Jesus. Therefore, we wouldn't need Catholicism. We wouldn't need the Protestant church. We wouldn't need all of these things, right? You'd get rid of it. And that's the kind of thing if you're going to have this many artists and this many musicians, you have to say, well, what will that be like? And, there is, without any shadow of a doubt, multiple implications for the idea that every single person, and obviously every single person doesn't actually want to do this, but if we want to encourage music making and say that every child should have the opportunity to make music, then, which I believe every child should have the opportunity to make music and to sing in choirs and to bang drums, because I do think that they're, just like I think they should be able to run in parks and play and do, because play and doing things that is, taking it away from this hyper competition would be very useful. But for those people that are earning money, this is what, in our book, we talk about what Jack Atterley predicted. And what Jack Atterley predicted was that by now, very, very, very few people would be making money out of music. And that can only happen if we change. And that's multiple. It's complex. But, we definitely need to see a redistribution of the profits from Amazon, from Apple. Spotify doesn't make any profits. Actually, it's a loss. It's running at a loss because it was there to prop up the idea that we needed to, that piracy, the swapping of music for no money, needed to be eradicated. And so nobody saw the deals that major labels did with Spotify, and they're not at all transparent, and it's very, very complex. But we do, in England, we've got the Broken Record campaign, which is probably the same. We do need to, for musicians and artists' sake and producers, the people that actually make the music, we do have to look at deconstructing the way money flows back to artists, reconstructing it, and that means breaking with patterns from the past, breaking with old royalty deals, breaking with who gets to own master rights. There has to be a shift because it is completely inequitable and musicians can't support themselves. And so it has to shift. I this week I trying to get a speaker onto the MA to justify why record companies have to own master recordings. And I can't get anyone to say that. Nobody from a record company will come and say that right now. And that is a historical moment, right?
Yeah. Yep.
No one wants to be seen to be the person that goes, oh no, we have to do that. So shifts do happen. I am hopeful. Things change.
Well, guys, I know I did call out for some questions and there's a couple in the chat, but I reckon I'm going to leave it because, thank you so much for giving so much of your time. This has been a lot to take in. I got to say also in the chat room, for anyone who's been hanging out for this whole 2 hours, this is a lot of stuff to fill your brain with. So I hope you're all ready to go and take a jog or watch Netflix or whatever it is you want to do to process all of this stuff. But I will say, I mean, this has already come up in the chat room, but we have Spirit Level has a Discord server, and we also have a private Facebook group as well, which you'd all be welcome to join if someone wants to post the Discord invite again, or it is, I think, in the About section of our Twitch profile as well. There's an invite link there. For anyone who's not familiar with Discord, it's just basically a nerdy chat room, mostly set up for gaming communities, but we've got a healthy group of maybe 70, 80 people hanging out and talking about a lot of this stuff and other things. That idea of I think, George, you're completely right that there are like networks of privilege, and networking often just is essentially actually someone in the chat said it was the mirage of networking, or it was a beautiful phrase. I'm scrolling back trying to find it, but networking is a little bit of a myth in some ways, but real community can emerge even online to some extent. So for anyone who wants to come and join us in the Spirit Level Discord or the Facebook group, you'd be more than welcome. Facade, that's right, the facade of networking, which is again those conferences and those panels that you were talking about before. But but yeah, in the chat room, these guys, Sally and George can't see this, but if you guys want to say thanks or have any like final words you want to throw at you, I will gladly communicate it across to Sally and George now.
And I will also add in there to say, like these discussions, often when you have these discussions, me and Sally, we talk about this like when we were constructing the book, in terms of like what you're seeking to do is to take these kind of quite abstract, not abstract, but these very multifaceted, complicated discussions and turn them into something quite linear for the purpose of the book. And so I hope like one of the things that we've tried to do through a lot of back and forth refinement, peer review from others and everything, is to try and streamline a lot of these arguments into something that places it in an order that to try and unpack it. I often think in these discussions, because that's the nature of them, they're freer for you to be more tangential, right, to explore these tangents that you run off on, and that's great. But hopefully what we've tried to do in the book is to give it that linearity and to unfold it in a way that kind of makes sense, I suppose.
No, totally. The book does feel like an unpacking, like a gentle unpacking of everything. So, and it's obvious the work that you guys put into doing that, because you're completely right. And I think it again feeds back into the idea of what we were sort of fundamentally talking about, which is the mental health of artists, and why artists so often feel confused and lost and bitter and frustrated. It is because once you start talking about all this stuff, it's like there's 100 things that are all overlapping and all kind of wrong. And so, thank you both for taking the time to really work on this over a period of years and put it together in the book. And I will also share thanks from Becky, who says, thanks heaps for doing this. The Real Moon Jelly says, Kay, thanks. I'm going to listen to Mr. Bungle and presumably still put their release out, I hope. Rose says, so wonderful, thank you. Dual Native says, thanks, Sally and George. John says, thanks to everyone. Kezi Fresh, this has been super interesting. Tom says, thanks. Guy says, thanks. David says, where can we get the book? Great question. Actually, before this chat wraps up, I will just post the link to the book. Probably should have done that at the start. There we go. There's the link to the book, University of Westminster Press. And I will add that it's a free PDF. You can obviously purchase a copy of it. And I've enjoyed reading, flicking through an actual real copy of it, but I love that you made it freely available for all people to soak up, because that's so valuable. Phoebe says thanks. Nick says thanks. Everybody says thanks. So I say thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Oh, one last question, because someone did ask it. What's the next research project? Is there something that you're working on next, or is it an extension
We're doing one already.
Okay, what is it?
We're going down the same hole further.
We're doing this we're like building on what we're doing now, but with working with a neuropsychologist to look at clinical measures of well-being as well, outside of the subjective readings of well-being from people that we're speaking to. We're giving it working with a neuropsychologist to give it those those kind of measures of well-being. Yeah,
and looking at daily stress, the impact of daily stress, like living with stress when people are stressed. But yeah, I'm hoping. Yeah, we're already on a path.
Yeah,
it's a bit like
round two.
Good.
Round two.
All right. Well, thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Oh, thank you. Cheers, Tim.
Amazing.
And
cheers.
Yeah. We'll talk again soon, I hope. And also for anyone in the chat, we do this every month. So we'll be doing it again in December with guests Sherry who is a music journalist, founder of Water and Music. and Brandon Stosey, who is the editor of The Creative Independent and an artist manager, and Sui Chen, who's a Melbourne-based artist and musician. And we're all going to be talking about a sort of a 2020 debrief and what comes next for artists, kind of big thing for Melbourne Music Week. So that's the next chat a month from now. Good people, more good people.
Great people.
All right. See you guys.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks a
Take
lot.
care.